above. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life.
So, I got a bad cough for some reason. I don't know whether it's allergy or sinus or something. But, or both. Yeah. So anyway, what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about St. Cyril of Alexandria, and then get into the Council of Chalcedon. We talked about the Council of Ephesus. We talked about the whole contest between the Antiochian school and the Alexandrian school of Christology. The Antiochians were engaged in a much more kind of much more of a focus on Jesus during his earthly lifetime, and Jesus as a man, a strong emphasis on, in other words, on the humanity of Christ. You know, not denying his divinity, but they often fell into a kind of an adoptionist Christology where Jesus was a man that God decided to develop a special relationship with, or to indwell, or to adopt, which was the one of the reasons why Theophany was the great important feast for in that context, because it was seen as Christ's adoption. In contrast, the Alexandrians focused on the incarnation. They focused on the unity of divinity and humanity in Jesus, on Christ as he is now, deified and enthroned at the right hand of the Father, and they primarily focused on an allegorical and typological, as well as moral, interpretation of scriptures. So, for example, the Alexandrians would most likely would produce something like the Great Canon of St. Andrew of Crete, which is this whole allegorical meditation on the scriptures, using all these examples of people and events in the Old Testament as examples of how the soul reacts to God. That's allegory. Whether there was anything to that in the actual historical people or event, it doesn't matter. But it's this example as it was set forth in the story in the scriptures itself that becomes the subject of the allegory. Whereas the Antiochians were much more focused on Christ's humanity, his ministry, his teachings, and so the greatest example of Antiochian, probably the Antiochian contribution, is St. John Chrysostom and his line-by-line commentary on the scriptures, which is, for the most part, very literal. It sticks very closely to the text. He does some allegory. He certainly does typology and moral teaching, but the literal historical level of interpretation is primary. He's not into the spiritualizing. The Nestorian controversy, which is what characterized the Council of 431, followed close on the heels of the Arian controversy, where the debate was Jesus a created being, or was he God incarnate? And this question of the relationship between the humanity and the divinity in Jesus. Arianism was actually about the relationship of the Logos to the Father, of the eternal Word of God to the Father, the Son of God. Was he of the Was he of the same essence as the Father, which is what the Nicene Council brought up, or was he of a different essence, or a similar essence? And there were all of these variations. Nestorianism was a little bit different. In the early church, there had been a heresy called Docetism, in which people thought that Christ's humanity was essentially just a kind of he was only man in appearance. He was not truly human. He was really a God taking human form, but not truly flesh and blood. And part of that was rooted in a dualist understanding, in which the flesh, matter, and things were understood as evil, and where the spirit and the uncreated was the good. And so how could the ultimate good dwell in something that was ultimately evil? And so this is part of the reasoning that went into the whole Nestorian controversy, because one of the questions that was asked was, how could the Word of God actually take on fallen human nature? How could it take on our brokenness, our sinfulness? How could he identify himself so completely with us, he who is so complete, absolutely pure and undefiled? And this is of course it's a good, legitimate, pious question. Of course, the Orthodox answer is he did. But the Nestorians were very reticent to admit that. So they say, there were, and historically there had been this whole series of ideas put forth, Apollinarianism, that the Logos of God, the Word of God, indwelt Jesus by replacing his nous, his spiritual consciousness. Another was that the Logos replaced Jesus' human soul. So Jesus had a human body, but in his soul he was the Logos. And part of this is also a reduction to rational categories, because it doesn't make sense that Jesus could be fully God and fully man at the same time. It makes more sense that he's half God and half man. Or, but how can he be both? And so this was the set of questions that was being asked at the time. Now, it came to focus in the person of Nestorius, who was a successor of St. John Chrysostom. St. John Chrysostom and Nestorius had studied under the same teacher, I believe Theodore of Mopsuestia, who was one of the great scriptural interpreters in the Syrian Church, obviously Antiochian, and he had what Father Florovsky calls an emphasis on anthropological maximalism. In other words, he really focused on the humanity of Jesus, and the whole adoptionist approach seemed to make more sense to him.
In a rationalistic sense, it made more sense?
Well, it's all rationalistic. And that's the problem with some of the doctrine. It's all rationalistic. But if you're going to create philosophical formulas, it's all rationalistic. That's just the nature of it. In the earlier on, before the after the first ecumenical council, but before the second, you had Saint Athanasius, who was the great theologian of the Incarnation, and who really set out in his treatise on the Incarnation how the divinity and the humanity of Christ could cohere in the same person. Athanasius drew on Origen. Origen had died in 256 in full communion with the Church, and 300 years later he was condemned as a heretic.
Wow.
So for 300 years he was regarded as a saint and the greatest theologian, and the father of the fathers. And so 300 years after his death he was condemned. And
wait, was he actually regarded officially as a saint, or just he was a big influence?
he was a confessor of the faith.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay.
You know, they didn't have canonization.
Right, yeah. But he was venerated.
He was venerated, and he was an immense influence theologically.
Yes, for sure.
And there was one of his later interpreters. Now, some of the most important interpreters of Origen and who conveyed his teaching were Saint Basil the Great, Saint Gregory of Nazianzen, and Saint Gregory of Nyssa. Saint Basil and Gregory the theologian actually compiled a book called the Philokalia, which means love of the beautiful, which was a collection of the sayings of Origen, or a collection of quotes from Origen. So Origen had immense influence. They left out, of course, anything that didn't seem kind of normal and orthodox. And the thing about Origen is he taught on several levels. There was the level for the general public, then there was the level for the Gnostics, the enlightened ones, which is weird. It was very weird. But his general teachings are basically, he was the first great theologian to formulate so much of the basic teaching of the Church, to put it into words. So Origen, really, he was the father of the fathers and the father of the heretics. He was all of the great theology of the Church, of the later Greek fathers, is contained in Origen's writings. And all of the theology of the heretics is also contained in Origen's writings. But there was no standard of orthodoxy at the time. There were no definitions. There were the scriptures, but a lot of this stuff, a lot of this material kind of takes over where the scriptures are vague and imprecise. Like the last thing it talks about in the scriptures is the nature of the union between the divinity and the humanity of Jesus. Scripture makes the statements, some statements, but then they need to be interpreted and put into context. And that context is what the tradition of the Church is. That's why the tradition is so critically important, because without that, you come up with everything from Lutheranism to Mormonism, or Seventh-day Adventists, or you name it, Jehovah's Witness, and so forth. All of which are individual interpretations by people who thought they knew better than the fathers. Whereas the great fathers of the church were those who are regarded by the church as sharing the mind of the church, and setting down, or maybe even giving voice to those ideas and doctrines and images and such that reflect what was always taught everywhere by everyone, which is the Laurentian canon formula. That which has always been taught always everywhere by everyone is the basic definition of Catholic Orthodoxy, or Orthodox Catholicism. And so when you have kind of idiosyncratic ideas and idiosyncratic doctrines, it's not kosher, essentially. Doesn't fly. And so part of Origen's teaching was completely in line with that, and part of it was way off. But he was still beloved in those 3 centuries in which after his death, he was still regarded very highly, especially among the most highly educated thinkers within the church. One of the people who was a great interpreter of Origen's writings was a guy by the name of Evagrius. And he was a disciple of the Cappadocian Fathers. I believe he was ordained by St. John Chrysostom as a deacon. And then I think he ended his life, went for the rest of his life into the monasteries like in Syria, Palestine or Syria. But his writings became a huge, huge influence, because he basically formulated the theological and philosophical underpinnings for asceticism and for contemplative prayer, and for the basic monastic practices, which are still with us today. Now, Evagrius was also, some of his writings were also condemned. However, he was in a sense kind of redeemed, because his writings were published under other names. And so in the Philokalia that we have now, which is a product of the late 18th century, there's a book by Nilus of Sinai. Well, it's most likely Origen, actually. And so his writings, his thought persevered, and it was developed. It became the foundation of educated monasticism, both in the Greek-speaking world and especially in the Syriac-speaking world. And so, for example, there is a huge influence of Evagrian theology and spirituality in St. Isaac the Syrian, for example. And his theology was both widely disseminated and held by monks in Syria, some of whom got caught in the Islamic incursions. And so there were these wandering monks in the desert that didn't want to have their heads chopped off, and they couldn't afford to pay. And so they kind of went underground as Sufis. That's where Sufism comes from. So, for example, Sufism, it even talks about Jesus quite extensively, but they don't have a deep theology of Jesus. It's probably a much more sophisticated Christology than most evangelicals, in reality. But the Sufis came out of, were these Christian monks that they kind of maintained their own integrity. One of the reasons that they're hated in certain parts of the Islamic world and deeply persecuted, like by the Sunnis, especially the Wahhabis, is because they're viewed as heretics. They're viewed as kind of crypto-Christians.
There's actually a lot in Kosovo, Sufis.
Mm-hmm.
And they actually have like a trinity
Mm-hmm.
of Allah, Muhammad, and Ali. And they have confession to an elder.
Mm-hmm.
It's very crypto-Christian.
Yeah, there's all sorts of things. And the Alawites, Assad of Syria is an Alawite. They have, their religious practice focuses on a ritual with bread and wine, which is rather un-Islamic. More reasons for the Saudis or Wahhabis to hate them. Anyway. But it was precisely this kind of spirituality that permeated so much of the Middle East. Now, it's really interesting to look at the missionaries. Now, we talked about the Council of Ephesus, how the Nestorians, basically, Nestorianism was condemned, but that a huge proportion of the church, especially the Church of the East, in the far eastern part of the Roman Empire, but especially in Persia, in the Persian Empire, went into schism from the Catholic Church of the Byzantine Empire, from Orthodoxy. And it was labeled Nestorian. It's not Nestorian, but it's the Antiochian tradition. The Syriac monks it was one of the most powerful missionary churches in the first millennium. In the West, they were more worried about, trying where their next meal was going to come from, because the barbarians, the Germans, were invading the West, and everything was chaos. However, in the East, especially before the rise of Islam, the church lived in relative freedom within the Persian Empire. But there was another unique thing about the church in the Persian Empire. It was not a state church. In the Roman Empire, the church was the religion of the state. And so that brought benefits to it. It brought all sorts of money in, it brought all sorts of people in. You had to be politically correct, you had to be a Christian, and you had to be a Christian if you wanted to have a state job. So it became fashionable to be a Christian in the Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire. In the Persian Empire, it was never a Christian empire, and the church was tolerated, but it had the ability to live and act in relative freedom. And they sent out missionaries all across Asia. They sent missionaries which essentially refounded or strengthened the church in South India, in Kerala. They've sent missionaries to Afghanistan, to Tibet, to China, Japan, and all throughout Eastern Asia. And Christianity was huge. You look today at some of the censers they use in Tibetan temples, they have crosses on them. Just old traditional designs. some of those monasteries were built as Christian monasteries. They broke into a library that they thought was Confucian. It wasn't. It was Christian in a monastery in Xi'an in China. And large parts of the Tang dynasty were Christian from 638. And all across the Silk Road there was a metropolitanate in Kabul, Afghanistan. There was a metropolitan in Tibet, and several all along the way. So, and the spirituality and the theology go back to Nestorius, or not to Nestorius, to Evagrius, to a great extent, and of course from Evagrius, not just Origen, but also the Cappadocian Fathers, because Evagrius was very much formed by the Cappadocian Fathers. This spirituality and theology had a huge impact on Buddhism, on Islam, especially in Sufism. Had a huge effect, I believe, also on Confucianism, and then Pure Land Buddhism is basically a syncretic form of Christianity, with even some of the same iconography. It was called the luminous religion, and they have stelae, these huge stone monuments that are carved, and so they have the interwoven Chinese dragons with holding up the medallion of a cross from the 7th century, I can only imagine what are in some of the libraries of those monasteries that are buried in the sands along the Silk Road. But you have to know Syriac paleography, and I don't. And you have to be a young man. And I'm not. So, anyway. The Church of the East is nothing to be sneezed at. We don't know a whole lot about it. It was huge by the 12th century, 13th century, so big that it was crushed by the Chinese, along with that other Western religion, Buddhism. And so the hundreds of thousands of Syriac Christians were martyred in China, and some of it went underground into Pure Land Buddhism and things like that. And then, of course, Islam crushed throughout Central Asia. But that kind of missionary expansion wouldn't be repeated until the 18th and 19th centuries, when the Russians went all the way across Siberia into North America. One wonders, or I wonder, if that could have been done by the Byzantine Imperial Church. Because everything that was done ultimately in the Roman Church had major political, it was part of the expansion of the empire, and there was, because it was a state church, and so political influence, the missionaries were accompanied by soldiers, Roman cities were established, and things like that. Whereas with the Church of the East, there was no political involvement. there is some interesting material available. I think there's one book called the Jesus Sutras. That's a kind of a short book, it has a lot of tantalizing information, and then some a fairly decent bibliography. So it is possible to find out more about the Church of the East. Most recently, the Church of the East was the predominant Christian church in Iraq and Iran. Of course, the Iraq War, the Christians were run off, and the Patriarch of Baghdad was living for a time in Turlock, California, which is out near Modesto, where he was murdered. And then one of his successors lives in Chicago, but the Christian population there is pretty minimal. I believe they're protected in Iran, but and certainly, but they were mostly in the East. So I don't think there's a whole lot of Church of the East people in Syria and West. The church in India is interesting, called the Malankara Church. They started out as, it was started by the Apostle Thomas, and so there was but they essentially established their ecclesiastical relations and linked with the Church of the East, and so it was huge Syriac influence, serving in Aramaic and all of that kind of stuff. And then they needed some more bishops, so they sent a delegation to Damascus. Well, at the time, Damascus had the Greek Orthodox, or the Roman Orthodox as they were called, the Church of the East, and the non-Chalcedonians, the Monophysites. They went to the wrong door.
Oh.
And so instead of going to their Church of the East bishop, patriarch, they went to the Monophysite patriarch in Antioch. And so the Church of India switched from being Church of the East, Nestorian, to so-called Miaphysite. So but they were never part, like the Ethiopians, they were never part of any of the theological controversies. They just kind of tagged along, and they lived their lives in their context, and there was not a whole lot of contact with the other churches. So anyway, that's kind of what happened with the Antiochian tradition. Within the Roman Empire, Nestorianism became the great bugaboo after the Council of 431. Everybody was afraid that, and would throw accusations of Nestorianism if somebody didn't exactly follow certain theological strictures, and it was and everybody was afraid of Nestorian influence. So in the I think in the late 430s, there was an archimandrite in Constantinople by the name of Eutyches, who put forth a doctrine. And Eutyches was a very elderly man, and very highly venerated elder within the church, and very pious. But his theology basically was that Christ's humanity got swallowed up by his divinity. He He was a Miaphysite, in other words, one nature of God, the Word incarnate, which was Cyril's great phrase. But there was only one nature after the union because the humanity got subsumed. And that was problematic. Now, there was great sympathy for Eutyches, especially by the new bishop who had taken Cyril's place in Alexandria, Dioscorus. And they said, well, he's an old man in his dotage, and anyway, he repented of his heresy and he confessed the Orthodox faith, and that Cyril was all right, and that Cyril was, spoke the truth and everything, but the others wouldn't hear of it, because here they had an example of Antiochian overreach, of Alexandrian overreach, and not just Nestorian overreach. Saint Cyril had been the great hero that oversaw the destruction of Nestorianism, both theologically, philosophically, as well as politically. There's another very interesting dynamic, though, that was going on at the same time, and coming out first from the Second Ecumenical Council, the Council of Constantinople, in which it elevates Constantinople to a dignity above Alexandria and Antioch and Jerusalem. Jerusalem really was still kind of iffy at the time, its status. It was just a part of the Antiochian Patriarchate at the time. But for Constantinople, being the new imperial city, because Constantinople was only established really in the year 330, to be given equal privileges with Rome and equal honor as Rome, as the text says, it created a huge stink within the empire, and rivalry between the ancient centers of of Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch, because Alexandria had always been the second city of the empire, and Antioch the third city, and they were great ancient, centers, and certainly both Antioch and Alexandria had very, very ancient Christian foundations. Peter was the bishop of Antioch. The apostles lived in Antioch. They used Antioch as a major base. Christians were first called, or the people were first called Christians in Antioch. So there's that, and then there was Alexandria, which was had this ancient history with the Jews, and there was the place where the Septuagint was translated, and then it was where St. Mark had settled and missionized and really established the church there. And so there was this huge kind of affront to their honor when Constantinople, which was literally the new kid on the block, and literally brand new, there had never even been a city at the site of Constantinople until Constantine decided to build his capital there, and so they it just ignited all sorts of issues. Well, one of the underlying kind of streams of issues was embodied in the 28th canon of the Council of Chalcedon, making Constantinople equal to Rome.
Wow.
equal to Rome, because it was the imperial seat. And Rome was no longer, basically. Rome was basically a battleground. There was still something there, but Rome's days were over. And so that colors a lot of the issues. There were also restive populations in Alexandria and in Egypt, the Coptic population, who were tired of, and the Syriac-speaking population that were tired of Greek domination, and who wanted to have a little more kind of autonomy. Well, what they got under Islam was not exactly what they were thinking about. So it turned into a rather chaotic mess. And theologically, all these tensions between Rome and Antioch and Alexandria with Constantinople only played themselves out in the politics that led to the development of the theology. Now, Cyril, of course, had been the one of the great. He was the great patriarch of Alexandria. I think from about 312 to 344. I think those were his dates, or 316. And he was about 30 when he was elevated to the episcopacy, and to be Pope of Alexandria was a big office, and it was on the same level as the or the imperial prefect. In other words, the governor of the Diocese of Africa. So it was very, very high level appointment, and there by that time there was also a kind of a parity between ecclesiastical office and governmental office. The Russians would develop that to the nth degree in the 18th and 19th century, but in the Roman Empire it was just beginning. So there was the civil head and the religious head of the city. Cyril was a very controversial figure, and he didn't shy away from controversy. He got himself in all sorts of things. There were all sorts of controversies. There were groups of monks. He was accused of leading a crowd against a pagan philosopher by the name of Hypatia, which ended up murdering her. And I think he was also accused of the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. And yeah, so Cyril did not endear himself to the non-Christian population, and at this time, a lot of the Roman Empire was still pagan, and there were also a lot of Jews. There was another event in Alexandria where the Jews blamed the Christians for something, and they staged a false flag. They spread the word that the cathedral was on fire, and so that all the Christians would come out to fight the fire, and they did, and they attacked them in the streets and killed many. Well, the Christians then took revenge on the Jews, and the Jews were stripped of all of their property, and they were kicked out of the city. And this was a very large population of Jews. So that did not endear him to the Jewish population, and And it got the royal prefect, or the imperial prefect, whose name was Orestes, very upset. Because that's a lot of taxes, from the wealthy. And so the relations were soured. And so there was all sorts of going back and forth and back and forth. Then there were controversies with a group called the Tall Brothers. There was 4 brothers who were monks who were tall, but which is, Egyptians were little people, pretty much, small, like 5'4", 5'5", and these guys were probably over 6 feet, and so, or who knows, Africans, they may have been 7 feet tall, but it was so there were adventures involved, and stories got multiplied with them, as well as relations with the monks in the Egyptian desert. And being the patriarch, he was the bishop for the Egyptian desert, the desert monks. Well, he became a great hero in the Christian world with the defeat of Nestorius at the council. He became, his writings became the criterion of orthodoxy, even though the slogan that he used, which was one nature of God the Word incarnate, which is mia physis tou theologos e sarkomeni, mia physis, meaning one nature of God the Word incarnate, and his party became known as the Miaphysites, or mia physis Miaphysite. And this, along with another slogan, became hallmarks of orthodoxy. God died on the cross. God died on the cross. In other words, it's called the Theopaschite formula. Theos, God, Pascha, in the sense, Pascha meaning suffered. God suffered on the cross, God died on the cross. As kinds of encapsulations of his Christological thought. Are you following me? Does it make sense? Okay. Now, if you think about the Nestorians, who had up until recently had a lot of influence, the idea that God suffered and died made no sense at all. Mm-hmm. Because their idea was that Jesus was a human being who may have been indwelt by God, he may have been adopted by God, but he was not himself God. And how could God suffer? How could God die? How could God be in a human body, subject to sin, subject to the passions, subject to illness, and it made no sense, and it was almost an impiety to think about. So there was just on the level of piety, there were things to resist this formula, and philosophically, there were all sorts of issues, and one of those issues was the meaning of the word physis, which gets translated nature. If we understand it as, well, natura, the Latin idea is nature, as something that we share in common, but it's not a nature doesn't exist by itself, right? It only describes what certain beings have and are. And if you go back to the the old Cappadocian and Greek philosophical formula of the who, the what, and the how. The nature is the what, right? The how is the energy or the activity, and you know what something is by how it acts, right? If it has the nature of a dog, it's going to act like a dog, right?
Right.
And then there's the who, because the who there has to be a subject that does the action, right? It's not just a nature does the action. The nature doesn't do the action. It has to be a person. It has to be a who. So the who is was ultimately resolved as being the answer was the hypostasis, the subsistence, that which stands beneath. Now, one of the biggest issues in all of this is the translation, and especially how it got transmitted, is the translation between, for this theology that was done in Greek, into Latin, and then into Syriac. And God only knows into Coptic, and much less Gaze, Ethiopian, and all these other languages. But the three main languages of the church, the primary language was Greek, the secondary was Aramaic, and the third, those barbarians out there in the West who spoke Latin. So you have this concept of the physis. Now, Cyril's formula was mia physis, one nature of God the Word incarnate. Well, okay. So how does that account for his humanity and his divinity? Because doesn't nature refer to concepts like humanity and divinity as opposed to the hypostasis? Because the ultimate Orthodox resolution would not be one nature of God the Word incarnate, it's one hypostasis of God the Word incarnate. Right? One person. Because the word hypostasis got equated with the concept of person, which comes out of the Greek, which was the Latin equivalent of the Greek concept, the prosopon. Now, the prosopon was the mask that an actor in a Greek play would hold up in front of his face when he was saying his lines. You've all seen those Greek plays, right? Yeah. That was the prosopon, the character, the role, which actually was concretized into a mask. A persona, it's essentially the same thing as a role in a play, a persona. Both of those are very weak terms, right? But when you combine them with the concept of hypostasis, I mean that which is a subject, that which subsists, you've got a pretty strong term, and it means a concrete particular, right? Who is the subject of the actions. Then you've got the concept of nature to deal with. Now, in the language of the Nicene Creed, Nicene and Constantinopolitan Creed, remember you have the word homoousios. That Christ is homoousios, the Logos is homoousios with the Father, of the same nature as the Father, right? Well, in Chalcedon, it comes out, Christ is homoousios with the Father, and he's homoousios with us. The same nature, same essence. And essence, ousia, you can see how it gets related to nature. or at least nature was defined in terms of essence, not as a concrete particular, but as that which is shared by a whole category of people, or a whole category of beings. So, so you have the who, which is hypostasis, right? The what?
Energy.
No. What is, it's the nature, right?
Okay.
And the how is the energy. Now in Jesus, you have two natures. You have the eternal Logos, who is homoousios with the Father. But then you have the humanity of Jesus, which is homoousios with us. He got his humanity from Mary. And the two come together. But how? In one person. Because there's only one Jesus, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's the pre-existent Logos, who takes on humanity. He takes flesh, and a human body and soul and nous, and while being, and is fully a human being while being at the same time the eternal Logos. The who is Jesus. The what, human and divine, the natures or the essences. The how,
Energy. Holy Spirit.
what kind, what's the energy? One nature, one energy, or two energies?
One.
Mm-hmm.
Holy Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
Not yet.
Now this is 2 councils later. And there was another controversy, because the controversy that was set up by Chalcedon was the monothelite controversy. One will, one energy. And the resolution is 2 energies,
Huh.
2 wills working together. A synthetic will from a synthetic hypostasis, in synthesis, in the sense of united.
Synergistic.
Synergistic, but more than synergistic. Synergistic means cooperating. So the wills, you could say, are synergistic, but the person of Jesus is the person of the divine Logos, and that excludes the possibility that Jesus had an existence independent of or apart from the divine Logos. There was no man Jesus that the divine Logos indwelt. Okay?
Yep.
Jesus is the product of Jesus is the result of the incarnation of the Logos. Jesus is the incarnation of the Logos. So who Jesus is, ultimately, his hypostasis is the Logos. Okay? The Son of God. And this is a very, very important teaching. This is the core of Orthodoxy,
Christology.
of Christology, and Trinitarian theology, Christology. You can see how it all comes together.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the big problems was Cyril, and we went through Cyril's 12 anathemas. Did everybody get the 12 anathema in your mailbox?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
It should have been. Andre sent it out.
Yes.
If you checked. I'll have him send out this as well, which we will. I hope I have enough. I'm not sure.
You're gonna send that out to
Yeah. This is the actual text of the, of course in English, of the Confession of Faith of the Council of Chalcedon. In other words, this essentially would be part of the creed. If the creed were, if the whole confession of the faith of the Seventh Ecumenical Council were read like it is on Orthodoxy Sunday, this is part of it. Of course, during the liturgy, we only read the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, but this is equally a part of the canonical dogmatic corpus of faith. In other words, this is some of the essential dogma of the Church. So remember Cyril's formula: one nature of God the Word incarnate. Problematic. And it was especially problematic because Cyril thought he was quoting Athanasius, but in reality he was quoting Apollinarius, who was a heretic.
Wow.
He didn't do his fact-checking. and it caused problems for centuries, as still does.
So that's what got him in the hot water?
Oh no, he had a knack for getting into hot water, and especially since he was the one fanning the flames. Yeah, he was kind of like the Donald Trump of the 5th century church. Actually, that's probably not a bad analogy in some ways.
Alexandria great again.
Oh, yeah. Well, actually, that was actually part of it. That was the agenda. Make Alexandria great again. In other words, seriously, who is this upstart Constantinople? We're the second city of the empire.
15 years later.
So he was tweeting out one nature, one God.
160 characters. Still not getting it right.
Well, if he's doing these short little quotes, that's, little things people can memorize. Boom.
Yeah.
What do they call it? Tidbits or sound bites or.
I bet I'll see that quoted on the internet someplace.
It's going to get a little like that.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, Cyril had a knack of coming up with these positions which were actually fairly easily understood, and he was very clear when he wrote. He was very highly educated, and his command of the language was very, very sophisticated. But that didn't make him, get lost in rhetoric so sophisticated nobody could understand it, which was a temptation in that era. But he wrote clearly. Now. In the Council of the thing that had gotten Cyril upset with Nestorius was Nestorius saying that the word Theotokos was nice liturgical hyperbole, but really was not theologically accurate. Nestorius asserted that Mary was the mother of the man Jesus, the Christ, but not of God, because God can't have a mother. So she was the mother of the humanity of the Christ. And so with the whole Nestorian thing, you have a kind of duality in Jesus, kind of a schizophrenic Jesus, which doesn't work. There's a little too much humanity, and not enough synergy or coherence. But so that pretty much that pretty much worked its way through the following years. Cyril died in I think 444, and the next controversy came up surrounding Eutyches, who I described. But it really was this collision between Antiochian Christology and Alexandrian Christology, Alexandrian political ambitions versus Antiochian political ambitions, versus Constantinopolitan political ambitions. And then you get Rome into the mix. Now, the Roman Church, through this period, had been the ultimate bastion of orthodoxy. There had never, up through this time, the popes had never gotten into too much hot water doctrinally. Rome was exceedingly conservative. For the first 300 years, Rome, all the services in Rome were in Greek, and because most of the Christians were Greek. Then it did switch over into Latin, but then the barbarians started invading, and literally all hell broke loose. And so by the time the what was it, 456? Was that, no, when Rome finally fell. 476. When Rome finally fell, there wasn't that much left, of what had been the great empire. And 80 years later, Justinian would come in and he'd try and reconquer parts of the West and incorporate them into the Byzantine Empire, or into the Roman Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. And he did succeed in making Rome a vassal state and all this, the West. But the West was basically collapsing into the Dark Ages, trying to figure out the Germanic peoples trying to figure out Roman law and how to take over Roman society, but failing miserably, and so and then the wealthy having withdrawn to their estates in the country, which they then fortified, which is what became castles, and then all the trade was all cut off in the Western Mediterranean because there were pirates, and they just stopped, which meant that the city of Rome, starved. It was a disaster. It was a disaster. However, about this time, around the name of the Pope was Leo the Great, and he was quite a remarkable theologian. And it's interesting that the Latin theological tradition, which had mainly begun to develop in Carthage and then spread north, had much more of an affinity towards the Antiochians than it did towards the Alexandrians. They were much more, the great Latin theologians were all lawyers, which is interesting. from Tertullian, Augustine, Ambrose. Augustine died when around 436, 440, just before the Council of Chalcedon, and he died as I think of natural causes, but the barbarians were sacking his city, just to kind of contextualize things. How another aspect of that's kind of interesting is that while the papacy, or while the Roman patriarch the Roman patriarch did not participate personally in the ecumenical councils. He always sent legates. And there's some very interesting work being done on that right now by Father John Baer, who's the former dean of St. Vladimir's. Because it's kind of curious that being the first among equals, being the undisputed first among equals, he would be the one to preside at any ecumenical council. And yet he himself did not. He would send legates who would be involved in the proceedings in his name, but the Pope himself never would go. And part of that was because the Pope was, because he was the head primate of the church. It would be his decision that would judge the conclusions of the councils. So he stayed out of them, so that he wouldn't be pulled either way. He wasn't involved in the fray.
That's what a chairman's supposed to do.
He was a chairman, yeah. However, Pope Leo was asked to express his opinion regarding the whole Christological issue and the issues of the theology of Eutyches, and so he sent a letter. Would you like to see that letter? I can have it sent to you.
Sure.
Okay. It's called the Tome of Leo, and what he does is he basically lays out, in a very balanced and but in Latin, of course, a theological approach, which thoroughly integrates Cyril's Christology and overcomes some of the terminological differences. He kind of integrates everything. And his letter eventually, after much controversy within the council, was read, and it became, and then later after the council, actually during the council, at later sessions, it was analyzed in terms of the anathemas of Cyril, as to what was where there were consistencies, where there were inconsistencies, what were the issues, were they actual substantial issues, and his tome was declared as a kind of a foundational hallmark of orthodoxy, resolving many of the Christological issues, and so it figured into the writing of this theological formula. So
this came from Pope Leo's.
it's a committee.
This came from a committee.
It's all committee.
It came from a committee, but it's based on his tomb.
His tome?
Yeah.
Well, it's based on a committee that took his tome and especially writings of Saint Cyril, the letters of Cyril, and as well as the previous ecumenical councils, all into consideration to come up with this formula. Okay, so what time is it? I think we can get through this. The Confession of Chalcedon provides a clear statement on the human and divine nature of Christ. We then, here's the text, we then, following the Holy Fathers, all with one consent, teach people to confess one and the same Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, the same perfect in godhood and also perfect in manhood, truly God and truly man, of a reasonable, rational, that is logiki, soul and body, consubstantial or homoousios, with the Father according to the Godhead, and consubstantial, homoousios, with us according to manhood. In all things like unto us without sin, begotten before all ages of the Father according to the Godhead, and in these latter days for us and for our salvation, born of the Virgin Mary, the Theotokos, according to the manhood. One and the same Christ, Son, Lord, only begotten, to be acknowledged in two natures, inconfusedly, unchangeably, indivisibly, inseparably. Those four adverbs are very important. Without confusion, without change, without division, and without separation. The distinction of natures being by no means taken away by the union, but rather the property of each nature being preserved and concurring in one person, or prosopon, and one subsistence, hypostasis, not parted or divided into two persons, but one and the same Son, the only begotten God, monogenetheon, the Word, the Lord Jesus Christ, as the prophets from the beginning have declared concerning him, and the Lord Jesus Christ himself has taught us, and the creed of the Holy Fathers has handed down to us. So, very balanced. This double consubstantiality in what's called a hypostatic union. The union of the two natures in one hypostasis. So it's not a mixing of divinity and humanity. It's not a changing of the divinity into the humanity or the humanity into the divinity, without mingling, change, division, or separation. But the concurrence of the two in one person, who is truly God and at the same time truly man. And I think this is interesting too. The distinction of natures being by no means taken away by the union, but rather the property of each nature being preserved and concurring in one person and one subsistence. So what do you all think? Does it make sense?
Yeah, it's excellent.
Doesn't, yeah.
Yeah. And it's clear.
So it defies logic, so it takes you back to the mystery.
Yep.
Right.
Exactly. It doesn't say how.
Right.
You know.
It's a reality beyond understanding.
Yeah.
Mystery. It's a real mystery.
But you have to cover in all the bases.
So it says he's truly God and truly man, of a reasonable or rational soul and body. That's very important, because remember how there were various heretics who said that the logos replaced the soul or the nous. in Jesus, but rather this is asserting that he is a complete, whole human being.
Is it fair to say, Valdika, that Christ's humanity exists in the Son of God in eternity, according to this?
Yep. Yeah, Christ is the Son, in his humanity is the Son of God throughout all eternity.
Okay. So again, that's
It's not
interesting.
his humanity, it's not diminished.
But I think you can also say because Christ is in eternity, in his humanity is not bound by time and space.
Oh,
So he
yes.
can appear in
Yes.
his humanity in the Garden of Eden that he took from the Virgin Mary.
That's interesting.
Uh-huh. And that's the deification of his nature, of his human nature, which in no way compromises the integrity of his humanity. So he sits on the right hand of the Father in his humanity.
Under curiosity, I observed as well, it goes into detail about how it's truly God, truly man, and all the other essences there. It doesn't make any reference of him being equally man and God. There's no equality mentioned anywhere. It's just that he's fully each.
Yeah, he's fully each. I mean, you can't. There's total mutuality. There's total. But how do you equate man and God?
Right. I just find it curious that they have to therefore repeat everything constantly.
Yeah.
Probably consciously avoiding saying that.
Mm-hmm.
So in theosis, the endeavor for us is to live the same way that Christ existed, fully God and fully man, in one. Is that true?
Well, that's a kind of a big order, but
Right.
yeah, that's the eschatological state.
That's the ultimate.
Yeah, that kind of theosis only occurs after the resurrection. Because we're sinful beings. So Brian, how does this strike you?
It's a lot more than what you'll hear in a Protestant church.
That's an understatement.
That's true.
Not really gonna discuss it.
A little above and beyond,
Yes.
Yeah.
exceeding abundantly above all.
But the theological vision of Christ is
Yes.
profound.
Yes,
You
absolutely.
know, and
Yes.
you know, I think there's a kind of a Nestorianism in Protestantism for the most part, to a great extent.
Different types of Protestantism.
Yeah, there
Some
are.
of it certainly.
And some of it's Arian. Some of it's specifically Arians, but some of it. And then some of it, then you get Mormons, and that's just pagan.
You know, the confusion of Christology opened the door for Arianism.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm still trying to understand the 300 years with Origen. What happened?
What happened is that his writings became so popular, and some of his more problematic writings became very popular, that you had a whole group of kind of eminent people in the church teaching Origenist ideas. In other words, the pre-existence of souls, you know, that souls were created at the beginning of the creation with the angels, and they fell into varying degrees of matter, of material density. So the noetic beings that fell only a little bit became angels. Those that fell more became human beings. Those that fell even more became demons.
So his
And
teachings,
demons are very dense.
they kind of took on an evolution.
It took on a whole kind of thing. It became a whole thing in and of itself. That the pre-existence of souls, the transmigration of souls, what we commonly refer to as reincarnation, and then apokatastasis. Apokatastasis meant that it was a doctrine that Origen espoused, which meant that at the very end of the world, all things would return to God, even the devil. All things would return to the state of the one, and then it's kind of like the expanding and contracting universe theory. And it would expand and contract and expand and contract. So we don't know how many times that happened.
I remember reading that was the basis of a lot of medieval wizards claiming that they would be able to contract it by using the word, which is where Cathedral comes from.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's there was some pretty weird stuff. Origen wrote that human souls were created perfect, and the perfect shape of a soul was spherical. Now there are some of us who approximate that better than others. As they say, I'm in shape, round is a shape. But with that, for example, and there was this whole Gnostic thing. Well, along with most Gnosticism goes dualism, and so you have the spiritual being good, and you have the material being evil. And you had the soul being good, and you had the flesh being evil. And so that which propagates the flesh, sex, is something evil. And so the idea was that human beings were created asexual, and there was the first creation, and then there was the second creation. That's when human beings fell, and they fell into material bodies, the garments of skin.
Wow.
And so the garments of skin were not animal skins, it's flesh in Origenist interpretation. And so sexual reproduction was evil. And so Origen, for example, at a certain time in his life was remembered as having castrated himself in order to resist temptation. Well, the church condemns this, of course. So there's all sorts of weird stuff. At the same time, he was probably the most brilliant scriptural scholar that ever lived. He wrote dozens of books. He wrote dozens of commentaries, many of which were burned. Only a small proportion of it has survived. It's said that he used to dictate to six separate books to 6 separate scribes at the same time.
This will give them time to write it down.
If you can imagine.
The first with ADD.
Yeah, wow.
He wrote, one of the things he put together was called a hexapla, which was 6 different versions of the scriptures in columns. So, and he was kind of interested in some of the same things that.
So I'm interested in the Philokalia, how that came through him.
Well, there was a book called the Philokalia that that was put together by the Cappadocian Fathers. That didn't survive. That has not survived.
Oh.
But the book that we have now, the Philokalia, was put together, 1,400 years later, by several fathers on the Holy Mountain. And which does have some origin in it, under other names, but for the most part is not. So.
You have a lot of different writers or different.
Right.
I haven't read it, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good. Not for novices. The Philokalia is a handbook for spiritual fathers. More than anything else. So.
Do they have the 5th volume in English yet, or is it still just the 4th?
It's it should be on the way to the publishers.
Oh, I finally read it in Serbian.
Yeah. Well, there's different collections, and some of them reflect the English collection, and others it's like the 5th volume in the Russian is mostly Saint Theodore of the Studite. But I don't think there's any of that in the English 5th volume. So.
What was that called? Faith of the what?
No, the 5th volume, because there's only 4 in English, but there's actually another volume in Greek and in Russian. This is not in English.
Oh. Yeah, the Metropolitan Chalcedon is working on it.
Yeah.
So, is there anything else? Any other questions?
What about the non-Chalcedonians?
Well,
who were they and how did that happen?
Well, the parties that rejected the Council of Chalcedon, they rejected it as Nestorian. Because, and they were, at St. Vladimir's they called them Cyrillian fundamentalists. Because they wanted Cyril's theology and only Cyril's theology. And essentially what Chalcedon did is it redefined the term thesis. Which up until that time was rather vague and could be used in different ways. But they used it in the sense of nature as opposed to hypostasis. Well, to the Cyrillians, this sounded Nestorian. And so most of the Coptic church broke off, much of the rest of the Antiochian church broke off, and then there were churches that followed them. And there were the church, many of the churches in Syria they became called the Jacobites. And so the head of the leader of the non-Chalcedonian party has always been Alexandria, the Coptic Church in Alexandria. Then you have the Syrian Jacobites. Then you have the Armenians, the Ethiopians, and the Indians. The Ethiopians have always been dependent on the Church of Alexandria for their clergy, for supplies, for whatever. The church in India, well, I told you about their story. And the Armenians somehow got into this mix as well. I don't know the history there.
I actually read that partly the reason was because when the council was being held, they had a war and they just couldn't come, and they sort of just got left behind. And they just continued that way. And of course also the Georgian church broke away and then came back.
Right. Right. So it was, it wasn't, anyway, the non-Chalcedonian churches, there was, during the succeeding couple hundred years, there were several attempts to reconcile. And the monothelite controversy, or monoenergist controversy, was one of those attempts to reconcile. the emperor came up with this formula. It's one person in two natures, but with only one energy. In other words, a synthetic energy of, coming from the one person.
That unites the two natures.
Yeah, well, there was actually some success with that, and there were many followers of the non-Chalcedonians who accepted that and re-entered into communion with the imperial church. Ultimately, it did not succeed because of the controversy within the Monothelite controversy, and that was condemned. Although, and the history is very interesting. I don't remember it all right now. I have to do my homework to bone up again for the class. But it's a pretty interesting history. And then Islam came in. And Islam, what did Islam take? Syria, Egypt, all of North Africa. It meant they cut off the Ethiopian church. It cut off the Indian church. And the Armenians, well, they were just kind of up there anyway, and they were isolated. And the Georgians weren't as isolated. The Georgians were more tied into the Byzantine, to the Constantinople. But
Eastern Antiochians too. They were taken too by.
Well, yeah, all the whole Syrian, and then of course Islam went into the Persian Empire and then eventually swept across Asia. So most of the non-Chalcedonian churches were very isolated between the years 700 and 1950.
Wow.
And the Coptic Church, they all went through very bitter persecution. The whole ISIS thing is basically the same. That's how Muhammad and his armies operated. And it was a pretty brutal time, and lots of martyrs. But there were, and theologically there was not a lot of intellectual ferment either in the non-Chalcedonian churches. I mean, there was some in the early centuries, but with the advent of Islam, it basically shut down. People went into survival mode. But it remained profoundly conservative. One of the names for the non-Chalcedonians is pre-Chalcedonians. And that's actually probably, it's not just politically correct. It's actually very descriptive. It's just that it's the churches that didn't accept Chalcedon and still remain structured according to their, as they always had been up until that time.
Trying to preserve the original.
Yeah. So. And then with the probably 17th century, 18th century, with the West went in, and you had the Crusades. And you go to the Armenian church; it's heavily Latinized, for example. Certain other Eastern churches, like the Maronites, totally and came into union with Rome, and the West created all sorts of havoc, starting with the Crusades and going on all the way to today. Throughout the Eastern Church. So that's a sad history. We'll deal with that too. You know, it's quite interesting, the history of the Uniates. And now Rome doesn't know what to do with them. It literally is told the Uniates, you're forbidden to receive converts. Go join the Orthodox.
Wow.
Yeah. And they don't want to. Of course, the Orthodox have treated them like dirt for the past 1,500 years. So, but the Catholics treat them like dirt too. And it's very sad. Anyway. You know, and then we'll get to talk. We'll talk about the whole Orthodox Roman Catholic split.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's also fraught with all sorts of nasty politics. Essentially.
You know, the Copts, I just saw this today, I think just today or yesterday, consecrated a church dedicated to the 21 martyrs who were beheaded a couple of years ago. Thousands of people there.
Yeah. All right. So if you have questions, think about questions for next week.
Absorbing. It's absorbing.
Shine, 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 road to Jerusalem, the glory of the Lord has shone on thee. Exalt, now exalt, and be glad, O Zion, ye radiant, O pure Theotokos, in the resurrection of thy Son. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and ever and into ages of ages. Amen. Christ is risen.
Truly is risen.
Christos Christi.
Christos
Christos Anesti.